This is Heal Your Mind, Heal Your Body with Dr. Schuyler. Discover how your thoughts manifest disease and what you can do about it. Here's your host, Dr. Schuyler.
Hello, beautiful souls, and welcome back to part 2. Are you functionally frozen? Are you feeling like you're on autopilot, numb, or watching yourself in a movie, completely disconnected from the world? Sometimes you find yourself just doom scrolling in private or hiding in the bathroom trying to avoid people. Do you find yourself battling like fatigue, depression, even low motivation, dislike of exercise? It might be possible you're experiencing being functionally frozen. This often comes out in chronic IBS or chronic bloating with no answers, as well as constipation. Oftentimes, this can manifest in people who have symptoms of a thyroid disorder, but with no markers showing a thyroid disorder. It's a sense of functional freezing. And last episode went over the vagus nerve, how this happens. So this dorsal vagal complex is this response to when we feel so overwhelmed by emotions, high senses of empathy, which we'll talk about the next episode. High sense of empathy, where we get this overloading sense of we can't fight, we can't flee, we have no way to express ourselves. So our body begins to go in this dorsal vagal shutdown, this prolonged sense of state of withdrawal and disconnect. And this dorsal vagal complex, as part of the vagus nerve, triggers this significant withdrawal from the external world based on this sensory overload. We get this shutdown response. Last week, we left off talking about the extreme case when the woman was passing out, once she left, the chronic invalidating relationship, the emotionally unavailable relationship. She was passing out for long periods of time, wasn't able to come to consciousness. She started to experience wellness once she was out of that situation. And then the other one was Celine Dion, the stiff person syndrome, this extreme sense of frozen response, this prolonged sense of grief, stuck in the pain, stuck in the emotions. So what causes these extreme examples, like the woman who's passing out, Celine Dion, from prolonged frozen grief? How does this even backtrack all into childhood? So when you think as children, the ability to protect or defend ourselves is pretty much just reliant upon the caregiver, the people around us. And if we talk about previous episodes, oftentimes people 60s, 70s, 80s, even 90s babies may have had an avoidant attachment parent. So the needs weren't routinely met. So if you feel like or even perceive that you are routinely unsafe or unprotected by your parent or your guardian or your siblings, you have a tendency towards this response as an adult, where you have this extreme frozen response. So when a child isn't able to fight back, isn't able to run from perceived danger, this incites this sort of panic response and making one numb or immobile in order to face the stressor, because a child's not able to fight back. A child's not able to get away. When a child's in a situation they can't leave, that they can't go anywhere, fighting back's not an option, running away is not an option. The child's brain becomes so flooded with the cortisol, the stress. This dorsal vagal complex shutdown is a last-ditch effort to conserve all energy because the danger is unavoidable. So we freeze. This is where the symptoms are the solution. So think to GI, think to thyroid, think to frozen biologics. If your mind feels numb, your body's going to feel numb. If your mind is in limbo, your brain is in limbo, your body is in limbo. If your brain is in limbic, your body is in limbic. Remember, the body is a subconscious representation of the mind. The mind feels it's in a frozen limbic response. There's no avoiding. There's no getting out. I can't get away from the danger. We freeze. We can't express our needs, our emotions, our thoughts. We freeze. The body then freezes. this dissociation from self, this dissociation from the mind-body connection. And think back to episode 1. What connects the mind to the body? Emotions. But emotions aren't safe to have if you've grown up in a childhood when it's not safe to express yourself. So this is where psychology and science merge. So we have this fail-safe survival mechanism. The frozen response occurs when the parasympathetic system spikes, when it comes in so strongly that it overwhelms the need to sympathetic arousal, fight or flight, sends a person to a state of freeze. Then this full collapse begins to happen, this immobilization, this dissociation, this partial freeze, inability to think clearly, inability to even access your own emotions, or even want to move your body. This can be momentary, or it can be short-term, or it can be long-term. And I like to think of it, when you play possum plays possum for a reason. We tell you I can't remember if it's a black bear or brown bear, but you're supposed to play dead. This is actually a primal, brilliant part of the brain. But when it happens for prolonged, when the predator leaves, in humans, we can continue this cycle indefinitely. Animals, there's this really cool example that when a lion is chasing a gazelle, and for some reason, let's say the gazelle gets away, you'll see the gazelle lay there immobilized, frozen. You'll see the breath almost completely stop. And then you'll see some quick, sharp breaths. And then this slow diaphragmatic breathing. What's happening is the gazelle is regulating their nervous system from a dorsal vagal shutdown, playing dead, lowering the heart rate, lowering the breathing. As it begins to pull itself out of dorsal vagal, it's coming up to more of a sympathetic response, fight or flight. It begins to take a couple of quick breaths, engaging the sympathetic. And then it begins to breathe normally. Then what's fascinating is you will see the gazelle begin to shake uncontrollably. This is the discharge of emotions and adrenals and cortisol from the lion chasing it. It's discharging the emotions, leaving its body energetically. Brilliant mechanism. But we as humans don't do that. We as humans, we hold in, we go numb, and we intellectualize these emotions. We look for the green flags in people. We ignore the darkness in them. And this is in the second episode after this coming up. Talks about hyper empathy. The problem with us brilliant humans is that we logic our way to stay in a dorsal vagal complex shutdown, whereas a gazelle just fully embraces the frozen response, embodies it, and allows the body to release the tension, release the trauma, release the cortisol. And then it pops back up and goes about and grazes as if nothing happened. But we as humans don't do that. We get stuck in this indefinite, perpetual cycle of this frozen response. Now, apply this to the woman we talked about last episode who thought she was, in this safe environment because there's no physical abuse. There's nothing really to report. There's no yelling. There's no screaming. But something inside doesn't feel safe. She wasn't able to use her voice. And I also like to couple this example with Celine Dion, this extreme form of grief. When you're not able to speak your truth, that causes more pain. And we talked about this before. This causes this internal sense of discord, this disconnect from self, this lack of safety within. When you go to speak a need, you speak your emotion and it's dismissed, it's invalidated, it's ignored. It's called bad juju. This creates a need to want to fight back, to want to flee, to want to express yourself. But if you're conditioned as a child to stay in the situation, we talked about cognitive dissonance, when you're forced to see the good in people and ignore the truth, this actually causes brain damage to parts of the brain, and it causes damage to the body. And we talk about highly empathic people. People-pleasing behaviors make you sick, just like the woman that I mentioned before. When you get so overwhelmed with the ability to advocate for your own sense of safety, when you people-please, you're not able to speak up for your own needs. You mute our own voices. We mute our pain. We're unable to express fight or flight. to either relationship, to parents, to coworkers, to friends. And we learn as a child, it's not safe to express yourself. You really shouldn't feel that way. Why are you crying? I'll give you something to cry about. Add on the attachment style, what an avoidant creates. Avoidants create anxious people. Anxious people lose the ability to speak up because their needs will be ignored. Stuffed rage, stuffed anger, stuffed pain. Too much for the mind to handle. Sensory overload. It's not safe to express emotions. It's not safe to have fight or flight response in acute situations. And the brain does its job. It's brilliant. I can't fight back. I can't flee. Let's move to freeze response. It's supposed to be a temporary state to keep us alive. A bear chases us, play dead. Deer in the headlights, it's meant as a brilliant survival mechanism, but we're in a chronic state of invalidation, a chronic state of avoidance, a chronic state of unsafe, a chronic state of overpleasing, a chronic state of empathy. It becomes so much overload on the mind, so much cortisol. The brain does what it's supposed to do. It shuts down and it disconnects the mind from the body. The glue that binds the mind to the body is emotions. So over time, you're not able to express your anger, dissatisfaction, resentment. The body gets flooded. You go into this primal survival state. And oftentimes when I've worked with serious trauma survivors, all trauma is serious, but I'm talking significant trauma. What women often report is, I just froze. I'm so mad at myself. I just froze. And now not only are they dealing with the anger at themselves for freezing, they're dealing with the trauma itself. And I have to explain to them, your body did its job. It put you in that frozen response to keep you alive, because if you would have fought back, you may be dead. If you would have run, you may be dead. It's supposed to help us in acute situations. It keeps us alive. But then what often happens is we then feel guilt. We then feel shame because we are frozen. We're not able to speak our needs. We do feel guilt and shame for laying on the couch. We feel guilt and shame for hiding in the bathroom and doom scrolling. We feel guilt and shame from feeling disconnected from our own emotions. When the mind's in limbic, the body's in limbo. So this dorsal vagal shutdown fatigue leads to the sense of guilt and shame, constipation, passing out, high senses of empathy. Whether you're neurodivergent or not, when you experience this sense of so overwhelmed with the sensory input from around you, of unresolved past emotions and traumas, remember, the gazelle holds the frozen response, holds space for the moment, allows itself to naturally come out of it and engage back in the sympathetic, and then engage back into normal activity. So we're not oftentimes afforded that situation to engage back in a sympathetic response. We apply those brakes. We go into dorsal vagal. And another example is, I had this, she's now a 20-year-old patient, and she had experienced significant trauma, and she was passing out. With the mention of a couple of topics, she would have these, what's called psychogenic syncope. She would pass out, and there was no known medical reason for this. So I spoke with a neurologist, and he was like, this is definitely a psychological issue because I can't find anything wrong in any of her scans. And I said, well, I got this. I highly suspect this is a dorsal vagal shutdown response. And he replied, I never thought of that. And I gave him a little 30,000-foot view of what my treatment plan would look like and what I thought was happening. And he unequivocally agreed this was probably a dorsal vagal complex shutdown, that she was immobilized in a chronic state of DVC, and that she was having a playing possum reaction, a gazelle reaction, and she was passing out because the flood of the memories and the emotions and trauma is not what happened to us. Trauma is how the body stores it. So it's storing all this trauma in the fascia bands. We'll talk about epigenetics later. It's storing all this trauma in her, and it becomes so overwhelmed. She needs to escape from reality, and she passes out. She's doing fantastic now. She's working, going to school. We had to get her out of a frozen response. And I like to think of this like a ladder to bring people out of a frozen response. And this does need to be done with a qualified clinician, by the way. This is not something to do on your own, especially if you do experience psychogenic syncope, or like the woman before who's coming out of abuse. It's like a rung of ladder. The bottom is the dorsal vagal complex, this extreme primal immobilization. You have to climb up the rung of ladder to a sympathetic, like the gazelle. You have to experience fight or flight. And then you go into what's called a social engagement, this level of homeostasis. So once we brought her out of this dorsal vagal, this frozen response, and I often describe to people, it's like being in an ice cube, this giant, huge ice cube, and you're stuck in the middle. Now, if you come out of the ice cube, it's like if you've ever had a nail fall off and your nail bed's exposed to the outside world, it hurts. Air hurts. It just hurts to feel for the first time. So when I have people coming out dorsal vagal, we melt the ice cube very slowly. First, kind of stick a hand out. It hurts. Feeling emotions hurts. So this cannot just be done immediately. This is done over time with a qualified therapist. You stick your hand out, you feel emotions, and you go right back into frozen response. It's called like touchdown landings. You're going to touch down into the complex depths of being frozen. Experience a connection with self in short bursts, might even be 3 to 5 seconds. And then you allow the person to go back into frozen response. So as I'm bringing people out of this dorsal vagal complex, we do touchdowns. We don't have to revisit the trauma. We just do touchdowns, connection to self. We kind of stick a hand out of the ice cube, experience what it feels like to have that extreme pain of connection to self and emotions. And then over time, the ice cube begins to melt and people can begin to feel again. And you begin to connect your mind to your body. You then begin to have control or mastery or even observation of your automatic negative thoughts, your awareness of protecting your peace, your awareness of stress contagion. So this patient now is happy, she's healthy, no longer has episodes of passing out, does not need to see the neurologist anymore. Her GI symptoms are improving of chronic constipation and gas and bloating. And she's 39 now, 30-year-old patient is happy, she's thriving, she has a new life. We had to work a lot on shame and self-abandonment and people-pleasing skills, which I'm really going to get into the next episode too. And she's found a place to speak her voice. So what are some ways that you can do when working with your therapist? Because I'm not advocating doing this without a therapist, by the way, but what are some things that you can do? You can start engaging in grounding techniques, and grounding techniques are reconnecting to the present moment only when it feels safe and okay. And I am a huge fan of ice water exposure, but a good tactile experience is holding the ice cube in your hand, experiencing various textures, and just kind of immersing yourself in the moment of feeling. Another good one is if you're in the shower and you put your hand up to where the water is flowing, it feels good for a second, but then it kind of tickles and it kind of hurts. You just experience a mind-body connection. That's a great grounding technique. Also, one of my favorites is those little things you put on your head. They're a head scratcher. And if you have someone do it from behind, it's this amazing jolt of like pleasure and discomfort all at once. But it's a great moment of mind-body connection. Also, creating what you call a comforting space. It could be with a certain blankie or a certain stuffy. I don't care how old you are. Almost everyone loves a good stuffy. I still have my favorite stuffy. It's a sloth, because a sloth is a chronic parasympathetic. So I love sloths. So creating this sense of comfort, it could be a certain space in your house, a certain chair, a blankie, it could be in your bed. This place where you're able to remove yourself from all this sensory overload engagement. It's not sensory isolation or sensory deprivation. It's just this temporary state of coziness within, this temporary state where you feel safe within your own body. When you begin to create this sense of safety within your own body, you're beginning to pull yourself out of dorsal vagal complex. Another one that I really like is soft focus gaze. When you stare at an object, and this one works really well, but if you have a diagnosed condition like it's called DID in the past. Well, dissociative identity disorder. In the past, it's called multi-personalities. If you have DID, it's actually very evidence-based, but I suggest you only do this exercise with a licensed trauma-informed therapist. It's very effective to go into theta brainwave state, but if you have DID, please do it under the supervision with a therapist. But otherwise, if you do something called a soft focus gaze, it switches you into theta brain waves. And theta brain waves that we've talked about in the past is a state of imagination and hypnosis. And it's a highly focused sense of self and what soft focus gaze is. And Lily even mentioned this in a previous episode about how she stopped the cyclical vomiting episodes. You stare at something and you just gently allow your eyes to fixate on one spot. Now, if you're driving, do not do this, please. But you allow your eyes to gently focus on one spot. And then you begin to notice your peripheral vision around you. Without moving your eyes, just begin to notice your peripheral vision. And just allow yourself to sink into the moment. And you may notice that things begin to get blurry as you just gently gaze upon this one object, just sink into the safety of the moment. You begin to notice that your whole nervous system starts to slow down. Now I could keep going, change my voice intonation, change the speed of how I talk. We can change brainwave activity by the way that we do that. But it's also can be a very safe and effective way to connect yourself to the present moment and connect yourself to your own breath. When you are present and you rest in the awareness of your own breath, you are tapped into a moment of authenticity. Authenticity breeds wellness. Authenticity is the bridge to inner divinity. So a safe and effective way to help bring yourself out of a dorsal vagal complex is to go outside and put your feet in the grass, to feel the sun on your face, to do a soft focus gaze. I like to, one of my favorite exercises to bring someone out dorsal vagal is to have them grab a piece of chocolate, a tiny piece of chocolate, and just put it in their mouth and just let it melt in their mouth. How does it taste? How does it smell? How does it feel? These are short burst ways to begin to connect yourself to your mind and body. So when you look back at everything and you look at how chronic this state of immobilization is, how common it is, there's so many of us people walking around this autopilot, this sense of disconnect from self. We engage and we smile and we talk to other people and we go home and then we collapse. We don't want to move. We don't want to get out of bed. We feel like introverts. We have highly, highly empathic skills. We feel hyper empathy. You may be in an environment where you're experiencing chronic invalidation or unhealthy relationships or coworkers, and you begin to have these emotional shutdown. You may have had parents where you feel chronically invalidated. It's not safe to speak your emotions. And you begin to have this dorsal vagal shutdown. And if you listen to my podcast long enough, you know the saying, we cannot heal in the same place we're being harmed. So I always ask people, if you're in a chronic long-term dorsal vagal complex shutdown, you're experiencing physiological symptoms that mimic thyroid disease, IBS, constipation. Consider what environment you're in, what environment you grew up in, and how much that you overload and take on other people's emotions to the point where you feel so overloaded that you have to shut down. And next week, we're really going to get into this. If you want to learn more about this, I really suggest looking into something called the polyvagal theory. And he really dives into this. And it's just a really magnificent, cool way of looking into this dorsal vagal complex. So next week, I'm going to get into hyper-empathetic response. It's not a disorder. It's not in the DSM yet. Yeah, I say the word yet, but it is something that, as therapists, we do look at this sense of hyper-empathy, over empathizing with other people to the point, like someone with autism often does, even though they can't express it, they're gaining so much sensory input, so much sensory awareness, that actually creates a dorsal vagal collapse, this dorsal vagal shutdown. So next week, we're going to get into, does empathy create disease? So I do have 2 books coming out now. Empower Yourself to Heal, Merging Science and Psychology, 8 Ways to Master Your Mind to Create Wellness. And it's what I'm talking about, this part 1 and part 2. what is the science of the mind body and what is the psychology of the mind body. Also, the other book, Empower Your Child to Heal. And it's the same thing. How, as a parent, can you help your child merging the elements? You can find it on the website. And if you sign up on the website, I've got some new free downloads. Actually, a chapter of the book, Healing Phases. You can see what healing phase you're in. I do have a workbook now that goes along with this podcast that, as you listen to the podcast, even go back to episode 1, it's like having a one-on-one session with me. You can work the podcast, work the workbook simultaneously, and it's like having your own personal therapist to kind of walk you through, what are the 4 elements of science? What are the 4 psychological factors? And then what bridges the 2 together that creates the mind-body connection and disease response? There is a retreat coming up in the fall, and also a workshop in the fall. If you're interested, just go to the website and type in or contact us, either workshop or retreat, and we'll get you some more information and details on that. It'll be published on there soon too. You can find me now on Instagram, Dr. Schuyler _, as well as on Facebook, Dr. Schuyler Hamilton, and my website is drschuyler.net. And I look forward to next episode and connecting with you all and healing vibes your way. Abundant blessings, everybody. Finally, it's here, available for pre-order, my book, Empower Your Child to Heal. 8 ways to help your child overcome anxiety, GI conditions, and autoimmune conditions. And it gets into everything in great detail that we've talked about in the podcast so far. What are your child's secondary gains? How is their attachment style impacting their health? And it goes into 10 things that your children wish that you knew about their anxiety or GI or autoimmune conditions, and also gets into like what healing phases that they're in. So it really gets into all the things into great detail that we've talked about on the podcast, and it's available now on Amazon for pre-order. Thank you for your time. I feel so grateful you have listened to the end. When we begin to understand how our body manifests stress, trauma, depression, anxiety, and even unexpressed emotions, we then create a space, a bandwidth in our minds to begin to heal our bodies. Healing is a decision, and I am grateful for yours. Abundant blessings, Dr. Schuyler.
To learn more about the work Dr. Schuyler is doing, please visit drschuyler.net. That's drschuyler.net. And remember to subscribe to this podcast wherever you like to listen.
Produced by Audavita Studios. Connect your voice to the world.